Hello and welcome to episode number 2 of getting started with attributes and VOPs inside of Houdini, and in this one we'll be talking about attribute blur, attribute transfer, attribute from volume, promote, visualize, all that kind of good stuff, and eventually we will end up creating this sort of a procedural motion graphics setup, which is relatively simple but looks pretty cool. Of course, you can improve anything and everything about it. And it's not just being procedural, of course, we can move everything by hand and everything will work pretty good. So let's get started. And before we begin, I just want to say that if you're interested in supporting the channel, please consider subscribing to the Patreon, because all of the scene files, all of the project files are there. If you want to follow along or just want to support the channel, that'll be the best way to do it. But of course, it's not mandatory. Only do that if you wish. Anyway, without further ado, let's actually start creating our setups. And I will delete everything. First things first, don't forget to save, as in 02, transfer, blur, promote, and all that. And start with, as per usual, geometry. So we'll start with a grid. Shift W to enable the visualization of the wireframe. And let's give it a little bit more of resolution. So first things first, I want to talk to you about attribute transfer and attribute visualize. So previously we visualized the attributes using the way of doing that, as in we just put the attributes into color diffuse in the CD and it was kind of visible inside of our geometry. However, it overrided the colors, which is not the best way to do it. So how do we do that? Let's just do the attribute transfer. Here we go. And we transfer something from the sphere that I created to our grid. And as you can see, there's, well, pretty much nothing going on. Why is that? Because, well, let's actually create some color. As you can see, currently, it does not really transfer anything from anywhere because we do not have any attributes, it's except for a position attribute. And of course, the sphere should be polygon, okay? Or polygon mesh or anything. It's just anything than primitive. So let's say we create color here as well. However, this one will be white and this one will be something like this, okay? And as you can see, we have already everything getting orange inside of our grid. However, if we decrease the distance thresholds and the kernel radius and all that kind of stuff, you will see that we indeed start transferring the attributes and everything seems to be working as expected, right? So if we move around our sphere, you'll see that indeed the color attribute is being moved from sphere to our grid. All right, this is fine. So what if we don't have the color attribute? What if we want to create some attribute that we want? So we do that by attribute create. And by the way, if you want to transfer one attribute from one geometry to another geometry, like we will be doing just now, you don't need to actually create the attribute on the geometry that you want to transfer to. So let me just showcase. So first things first, the name will be beveler because at first we will try to bevel things inside of our grid using the transfer. And the attribute transfer will be, will be beveler, as you can see. And indeed, we now have 2 points attributes. One is beveler, the other is P for position. All right, so now we need to actually see our attribute. And there is this attribute visualize. And we go to the visualizers and we say that the attribute that we want to actually visualize would be beveler, right? And right now, if I enable this, you'll see that something is probably happening, but not really. So basically, previously, I forgot to tell you that before we actually started to transfer the attribute, previously we had no beveler attribute before ever. And then when you just create attribute create, right? when we just attribute create, here it is, you will see that the default value for attributes is 0 and the actual value is again 0. So what we're going to do is actually give it the value of 1, press enter, and we can see the light blue is going on. So the light blue is because as you will see that the color ramp goes from, it's kind of like infrared, right? However, if we know that the maximum of our attribute is 1. That's what we've written here. However, it actually visualizes from 0 to 10. So if we reduce that to 1 as well, you'll see that it is more accurately being visualized from 0 to 1. All right, so now that we know that we have our attribute and everything is being promoted and working well, we can finally do the poly bevel. Place the distance like 0.1 or something, scale by attribute, and again delete this and say beveler, right? And now you see that indeed the bevel is being controlled by our attribute. You can enable or disable the visualization by pressing this icon, and you will now see just the poly bevel result. So if we now move around our geometry, you will see that indeed bevel is being controlled. However, as you can see, it's not really smooth or anything. It's kind of like a bit janky. So that's not very good, right? So how do we make it so when we animate our things, the attribute is being transferred more smoothly than we currently have here? So the way to do that would be actually attribute blur. And by default, it will start working on positions. So if you have some sort of jagged geometry, you can actually blur the position of attributes and the geometry will be smoother. However, in our case, of course, we want just to smooth the attribute that we have that's called beveler. Of course, the name does what it says, the blurring iterations and the step size of the blurring iterations. So kind of like this, you can increase or decrease the blurring. And of course, when you start transferring your things, it will move around, everything will be looking much better. And our poly bevel, if I disable visualization and go back to transform, you will see that indeed it actually starts to be more and more smooth. So that's pretty cool. However, you will see that now our attributes are just point attributes. And what if we want to actually do the poly extrude like we did previously, right? The poly extrusion should be controlled by some sort of a primitive attribute, right? The bevel works on edges and points, so the point attribute beveler works well. However, the poly extrusion, if we make the distance something like this, and we do the individual elements, just for visualization's sake, we do something like this, you will see that if we start writing the local control distance scale and we start typing beveler, nothing will happen because the beveler, again, is a point attribute. And what we need is a primitive attribute. How do we convert one type of attribute into another? Is attribute promote. So we place attribute promote here, and we say that original name was beveler, original class was point, and the new class that we want is, of course, primitive. And as you can see immediately, when we've done just that, you will see that our poly extrude now respects our attribute as well. So here we are. Let's transform our sphere a little bit. You will see that indeed the results are in. It works. So next up, let me get back to our attribute visualize, and I will disable the blur, enable the actual visualization, and start tweaking the conditions. So if I do the distance threshold, kind of like this, and I'll increase the scale of our sphere a little bit, you will see that it does not actually include everything that's inside of our sphere. So basically the attribute is being transferred from the surface of the sphere, right? As you can see, from the surface of the sphere, but it doesn't take into account anything that's inside of it, right? Of course, if we increase the distance threshold, it will eventually be so large that it will encapsulate everything inside. However, it will grow outside as well. So that's, again, not very good. So how do we alleviate that? Is actually we do the attribute from volume. However, as you might have already imagined, we have to have volume instead of, just geometry, of course. So we get grid here, and here we need to have some sort of a volume. So we do that by converting our geometry from polygons to VDB. So VDB from polygons, enter, here it is. So again, previously I have talked about this, but if you don't know or missed or don't remember or whatever really, we create VDB from our sphere. All right, so interestingly enough, we can actually, so we have the volume. However, we can create this point attribute on the volume. And when we want to move our volume around so that the we can, do something like this, right? So we can just transform our geometry like we did here. Instead of actually transforming the sphere, then converting it to volume, we should transform the volume itself after it has been created, so it doesn't recalculate volume all the time. And actually do the transformation after we created the attribute as well. It's not mandatory, just, for organizational purposes. We create everything, then we move it around, right? Okay, so transform to attribute from volume, and here it is. Of course, it says attribute name that's being transferred is actually CD. This is why we have gray here, black here. But we know that we have the beveler, and indeed we can just say beveler. Attribute type float, however, the attribute size is, well, it's not a vector attribute, it's just the float attribute, right? As it says here, point float. So float, just 1. It doesn't need anything else. And we need to visualize. Here we are. You'll see that we have kind of the same result we had previously. However, we can just press fill interior and you'll see everything finally works as expected. And now, if we do even the attribute blur and visualize, kind of like this, you'll see that finally we have everything inside and it gradually goes outside. So our poly bevel works much better and it fills inside our geometry regardless of the conditions that we had previously, like distance threshold and kernel radius. The attribute from volume actually fills everything and you don't need to tweak a lot of things. Of course, as you can see here, it's kind of a little bit weird. So we have a little bit of a poly beveling happening here, and we can remap our attribute like this from here to here, something like input range 0.3 to actually 1. I think it will be pretty good. All right. And here we go. If I disable the visualization, we'll see that everything works as intended. And if we poly extrude, it looks kind of weird because it got inverted, and we can flip it back if we do the input range from 1 to 0, and here we go. Of course, you can tweak the ranges here as well, or you can indeed remap it using the attribute VOP. We will talk about that a little bit later, how to use attribute VOP to, using the attribute ramp and all this kind of good stuff. and we will check out how to control our attributes a little bit better. However, for now, I think this will do just fine. Of course, you can tweak the bevel amount. You can, again, tweak the input ranges so it kind of looks a little bit better. I think we can make our sphere much smaller because this is apparently too much. And here we go. Finally, we can just do the subdivision. So we had some sort of a result we had previously. Do the null here, maybe increase subdivision to something like 2. Do the poly extrusion maybe through something like 4 divisions. And here we go. Maybe even disable the poly bevel so it's not looking as distracting. Shift W to enable or disable the visualization of wireframe. And finally, if you're interested how I was creating the procedural animation, because right now, if I move it using the mouse, you'll see that, well, it's hand animated, so to speak. And of course, you can do the procedural animation if we go inside of this transform, remember, where we just move our volume around. We get to here, this transfer, let's say procedural animation, and translation, we'll do the sign of $T, maybe multiplied by 30. And if we animate it now, you'll see that indeed it kind of moves from left to right. Of course, we can tweak the speed like by 90 or something. As you can see, it moves much faster. And there you go. If your computer cannot handle, for example, the subdivision level of 3 or something, and maybe, whoops, if you want to compute the normals afterwards to make it really, really smooth, and it doesn't actually do it real time enough, like in my case, right? What you can do is you can do hold down left mouse button, flip book with new settings, do like the full HD resolution or any resolution you want, and press start, and it will compute in just a second. Here you will see that it does the preview of our full animation timeline. And now, if you enable or disable this clock button for 24 FPS, for example, you can now preview the real-time result of your procedural animation without the necessity of, waiting of calculations of subdivision and normal and all that kind of stuff. So basically, it's for your personal preview purposes. So that's good. This is how you create attributes. Remember, you can transfer attribute from one geometry to another using just attribute transfer. Let's see. Okay, here we go. And of course, you can visualize using attribute visualize. Don't forget to actually enable the visualization doing this pin button, right? Then, of course, you can transfer attributes from volumes. Don't forget to first convert it to volume, right? Create the attribute. Don't forget to write the result of your attribute that you create, like value of 0 to 1 or any other value that you want. You can blur the attribute using the attribute blur. And of course, you can promote it from point to primitive or back again. Actually, you can promote from vertex to any other attribute. For example, if you want to use some sort of attribute in materials of Unreal Engine using the vertex color, that would be a pretty good idea to actually convert from point or primitive to vertex explicitly. This will work best inside of, I don't know, maybe Substance Painter if you want to make different IDs for your maps. Enable, disable using this pin button. So hopefully this was useful for you and you are enjoying your learning journey of the attributes and VOPs inside of Houdini. I know this wasn't, exactly mind-blowing stuff, and maybe some of you might consider it kind of a little bit boring. However, this is really important to understand how to work with attributes on fundamental levels, because if you don't really get how all of this works, and we are trying to explain everything on relatively easy examples, you will be having a little bit of a harder time understanding how the attributes play the role inside of simulations or procedural modeling or something like that. So again, just hopefully you're having fun with this, because I'm trying to make it in the least boring possible way. So anyway, we have a lot more ground to cover. We haven't talked about the VOPs themselves all that much. So we will cover that in further lessons, and hopefully you're having a good day. I'm really looking forward to seeing the next videos. Don't forget to subscribe. If you have some ideas, suggestions, just leave a comment below, and see you in the next video. Have a nice day. Bye-bye.